Chapter 2, Therapy. A squeaky woman's voice spoke. "Will you please get off the table, Justin?" Justin blinked as reality came crashing into view. Dazed, he glanced around the room. It was a medium-sized office with just one lamp lighting the entire space, placed on the petite coffee table that he now stood on. Cheap furniture, archives of books, and 7 framed degrees from childhood psychology filled the rest of the room. On one side of the table was the couch, and on the other was a large reclining chair with an old woman laying in it. He had somehow climbed off of his couch, onto the coffee table, and brandished an invisible sword in the air. He breathed heavily, inhaling the scent of multiple cats, and realized that the woman who spoke to him was his stinky therapist. The therapist, with matching bags beneath her saggy 40-year-old eyes, blended right in with the subtle gloom of her tiny office. Her face, framed by long gray hair, seemed to reflect the darkness of the night. She wore an overlarge black sweatshirt that covered her tiny body all the way to her ankles, designed with an obese cat staring intently at anyone unlucky enough to cross eyes with it. Her attitude was just as drab as her decorative taste. "Please retake your seat," the therapist said without any emotion, like she had seen this act 1,000 times before. Of course she had, because she'd been a therapist for over 20 years. She began delving into childhood psychology when she found out that she couldn't have a child of her own, leading her to have an intense desire to dictate how everyone else raised theirs. "Sorry," Justin stumbled as he climbed off the table and back into the discomfort of the confessional couch. "I guess I lost it a little." "You sounded quite delusional," the therapist said. "Now let's move on from this disastrous waste of my life, and we will recount the dream you've been having in its entirety from the very beginning." "You sure you're ready?" Justin asked, almost afraid of the answer. The therapist lazily reached down to a purse that was underneath her chair and pulled out a recorder. "Recording log labeled beginning at 2 minutes on the 4 seconds to 3 minutes at 24 seconds of our session with the patient Justin Smith, who will go over all of the aspects of the delusions he's suffered at the Christian Way Church on the Friday night of 1/18/2013. Now I am ready." "It wasn't a delusion," Justin said. "I'll be the judge of that," the therapist said as she nestled the recording device next to her purse on the ground. "Where did it all begin?" "It all started on that Friday, 3 weeks ago now. Back when I wasn't a warrior, when I was just a middle schooler." The therapist interrupted by coughing loudly as she dug through the recesses of her notes. "From my records, you are an adolescent of 14 years of age in the 8th grade. Height 5 feet and 7 inches tall, weight 120 pounds, black hair, hazel eyes of Hispanic descent on your mother's side, and Irish on your father's. So as I can see in your records, you are just a middle schooler, Mr. Smith." "Not there," Justin replied, staring into his memories. "Because of my faith in God, I had unbelievable powers. And with those powers, I was able to fight wars, help my friends, and serve my king. There, I was a holy knight." "I know the amount of delusion that these cults known as churches feed people," the therapist said. "Have you stopped reading that fantasy tale of poison known as the Bible? And stopped talking to your imaginary friend God?" Justin stared fiercely at the therapist. "I might have stopped reading the Bible because my parents are on board with your methods, but I will never stop praying to Jesus, the Lord of my heart. I will always be his warrior. Besides that, I had a lot of time to memorize whole passages of God's word in the in-between. I think about them every day." The therapist sighed. "Poor baby, so far gone into this mindless state of coma known as religion. I will make you better, I promise. Besides, everyone needs a security blanket as infants, not as adults. Did you also start that other thing I asked of you last week?" "The diary?" Justin asked. "Journal," she said. "What did you name it?" "What was I supposed to name it?" Justin asked. "Diaries of a Holy Night, the In-Between?" "But yeah, I've made an entry or 2 into it." "Be sure to keep up with that, because I need to make research notes about your entries in a couple of months or years." The therapist laughed. "Continue." Justin sighed, either in resentment for going through this process or for thinking that he was the only sane person in the room. He couldn't decide. "So it all started with the youth group at the church I attended until I started therapy after school that Friday." The church was having a lock-in event, which is where the youth group spends the nights in the church goofing around and learning about God. On top of that, there were games, junk food, water balloon fights, drawing on people's faces when they fell asleep, and the next morning would be a teen's perfect breakfast, day-old pizza. I went, but really I was going to hang out with friends. The lock-in started with a boring church service, which I was told the next day was about choices. I didn't pay attention. I sat next to my best friend, loyal Lance Lancaster. He was chilling next to our crew, which consisted of brainy Brad Tackles, tired Timothy Askmore, cool Conrad Durasteel, champion Chase Masters, and Money Mike Prickles. At the end of the service, our youth pastor asked that if anyone had any doubts at all about their commitment to Christ, they should come up and get prayed for. I thought to myself, I was pretty much in the middle, not just with Christ, but with everything. So I got into line. I had recently become an actual Christian, even though my family had been bringing me to that church since I was born. I didn't feel much like the Christian depicted in the Bible, and I was still dealing with a lot of resentment towards God after the accident. The therapist's eyes flashed in Justin's direction. "Let's discuss that for a moment. What happened to your sister?" "You know what happened to her," Justin barked. The therapist lazily raised her eyebrows. "Sorry." Justin took a couple of calming breaths before continuing. "The pain is still fresh, even after so long. My sister, Margot Smith, was 16 years old and so beautiful that every football player wanted to date her. The day of the accident, which seems like a blur to me now, she was going to take me home after her cheerleading practice because I had to stay after in detention with my best friend Lance for fighting. The practice ran later than usual, and when she showed up, she was crying her eyes out, staring at her cell phone. She stormed out of the gym as the other girls laughed. I tried asking her what was wrong, but she snapped at me to shut up and get in the car." Justin's voice started to quake as tears welled up in his eyes. "We were driving home really fast and she was texting. All she was paying attention to was that stupid phone. I kept trying to tell her to watch the road, to think about what she was doing, but she wasn't listening. She turned her whole body to scream at me. That's when we moved out of our lane for a fraction of a second and slammed into an oncoming vehicle. Next thing I remember, I woke up looking at the ceiling of a hospital room, hooked up to more machines that I could count, scared. My sister was next to me, unrecognizable, covered in bandages from head to toe with a tube in her mouth. It was forcing her to breathe. I watched her for a few hours before that deafening flatline echoed in my ears. I lost my best friend that day. Why? Why had God taken my sister away from me? How could God need her more than I did? I remember being angry with God, who I didn't know if I believed in at that point or not, but I needed him to be real so I could blame him for my sister's death. I needed someone to take the blame. Then I watched as my parents came in and fell weeping at their only daughter's lifeless shell. My mom tried to wake her up by kissing her repeatedly on her cold cheeks, and my dad just held her hands and wailed like he'd been shot. I cried away the many nights that I was stuck in that terrible place. I found out the day before the funeral why she was so frustrated. She was texting her boyfriend. She was sent a message that revealed a picture of him making out with her best friend. That's what led to the accident. Those two were arm in arm at the funeral like nothing had happened. I remember hating him so much that I wanted to kill him. I figured since he had killed my sister, I should be able to kill him fair and square. He tried to come up to me near her coffin. Margot looked more beautiful that day than she had ever. Before that scumbag could speak, I told him to never talk to me or my family ever again and leave the funeral. Those two left, shaking their heads in pity. The saddest thing is, the last words she typed to him were goodbye. She gave the kindest of courtesies to her worthless ex-boyfriend. If I wished for just one thing in those days, it would have been for my sister to tell me goodbye back. Tragic loss of that magnitude can warp any young mind. The therapist clawed her way back into Justin's thoughts. Even into believing fairy tales known as the Bible? Who else was at the funeral? There was all of her friends, the cheerleading team. My friends, Dad's police friends, my family, the church, and the family of the other car involved in the crash. Justin's face fell into bitter grief. They were on their way to see their newest addition, Samantha Torkelson, in the hospital when my sister's car had moved into their lane. They were all there at the funeral. I was afraid to speak to them because I figured they hated me for the accident. But when I did talk to them, they told me that they forgave my sister. They felt terrible about the whole thing and wanted to pray for me. The whole family placed their hands on mine, praying over me. 2 people were buried that day, my sister and me. The therapist studied him from over the pad of paper in her hands, where instead of notes, she drew cats wearing men's underwear. "You seem very much alive to me." "Well," Justin said calmly, wiping away his tears, "that's because when they prayed for me, I accepted the Lord Jesus Christ into my heart. I died to my life of sin and was born again as a son of God because Jesus died so that everyone could be saved from their sins." "Not this again," the therapist chided. "I'm sorry for your loss. Let's continue with your story. I believe you said that you were in line at the religious service." Justin continued. "So as I stepped up to the front of the stage and got prayed over by our youth leader, David Ling, he is a huge Viking-like Asian powerlifter from North Dakota, held all kinds of records. One of the things that he was known for was always being happy for no reason at all. That night, David asked me what I wanted to pray about. I remembered hesitating because I felt really weird even telling him, but I told him that I wanted God to test me so that I would have proof that I could see my sister again and that my life could have some sort of meaning without her. At this point, a crazy smile spread across his face. We closed our eyes and just stood there. He was supposed to pray for me so I could go back with some sort of realization about my life that I didn't have before, but he wouldn't. I started to get irritated, and every frustration that had built inside of me spilled out in the form of a challenge to God. After I prayed, David broke the silence with, "It's going to be tough, but remember who God is. You'd be surprised how great you can be when you give everything to Him." The puzzled therapist looked at Justin with a sort of wayward expression. "What was he talking about?" I believe he was telling me about the in-between. Like, no matter what, God is my strength. Justin answered, causing the therapist to shake her head. After service, I walked out of the stage area of the youth room to chill with my friends, more frustrated than ever. Some of the kids went to eat pizza, while most went to play bullet shoot on the gaming consoles. As the night wore on, our youth pastor gathered everyone together to play hide and seek. We were playing a 2-team style game, so of course I grabbed Lance. The youth pastor and David were the first ones to be it, so everyone else hid throughout the building. And that's when stuff started getting weird. Lance and I ran right past people. Nothing crazy about that, but they all looked as if they were staring right through us. All of them. We thought it was just because of the game, but that all changed when we saw Brad Tackles disappear right in front of us. I couldn't believe my eyes. He turned a corner like something was chasing him before he vanished. Next, Timothy Askmore walked past us, stopped on his way to the kitchen after observing Brad's disappearing act. Then he disappeared right where he was before he could utter a sound. Chase Masters popped out of his hiding place behind a couch, asking if anyone else just saw what he did, and he disappeared. Then Conrad Durstier absent-mindedly took a step out of the bathroom, and before he took another, he disappeared. Right next to me, in the middle of the entryway, Lance looked at me, and with a flicker of a smile, he was gone. I had this feeling that it was just a matter of time before I was gone too. Out of nowhere, Mike Prickles appeared. It looked like he was yelling, but I couldn't hear him. I reached out to calm him down when our arms touched. At that moment, I heard him say, "Something's wrong!" I nodded in agreement and disappeared myself. End of chapter 2.